In this chapter of the course, we're going to begin talking about how we can go about structuring our HTML documents. Now, what's important to understand is we're not going to be talking about layout in this chapter. Really, what we're about to do has nothing to do with the visual presentation of your content, but rather how you go about grouping your content, making those groupings of content easy to consume and understand by user agents. Ultimately, by understanding how to create a good HTML structure, you make your content more legible to web browsers and more legible to search engines. Let me show you what I mean. Our focus, of course, is going to be in the structure section of the insert panel. You'll notice we have things that we've already worked with: unordered lists, list items, paragraphs. All of these things add structure to your HTML document. But really, what we want to look at is how we can continue to add structure for more sophisticated elements, things like navigation systems, asides, or even headers. Now, HTML5 introduces a series of structural elements that provide semantic value to the user agent. A common way to group content in previous versions of HTML was by using the div element. The div element's role in web design has been greatly reduced in HTML5. Now, if you haven't worked with previous versions of HTML, you really have nothing to worry about, but I will emphasize the importance of these new structural elements throughout this chapter for any of you who have worked with previous versions of HTML. Let's jump over to a slideshow here for just a moment. And again, what we want to talk about are the new HTML5 structural elements. Now, these are important because, again, the older structural elements were called div elements, which were nothing more than generic containers. The div element had no semantic value to a user agent, a web browser, or a search engine. But it did allow you as a developer to group content together. But again, it's important to understand that it had no meaning to the web browser. Now, of course, if you had several different divs, you could easily distinguish between the divs by using things like ID selectors and class selectors. But you could really name any of these divs anything that you wanted. And again, it only added meaning to you, the developer. So you could look at your code and have a better understanding as to what that div was doing, or potentially allow another developer to have a better understanding as to what that div element was doing in terms of the type of content it was containing. Now, again, there were no standards for this, but as the W3C did some research, they found that some developers would use common IDs for div elements, things like headers and asides. And so they took that information and created new structural elements that did in fact provide semantic value to user agents. A web browser now looking at an HTML5 document can quickly identify a major navigation system because you can place that navigation system inside of a nav element. In previous versions, you would just place it in a div element, and again, the browser would have no way of distinguishing the navigation system from a header based upon those div elements. But all of that has changed with these new HTML5 structural elements. So throughout this chapter, we're going to explore these HTML5 structural elements and look at how we can implement them to group our content within an HTML page.